Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Biblio Files, a show from the Ann Arbor District Library in Michigan that's all about books. Each episode, we take a few minutes to talk about a book we've read on a certain theme. And this time, we're talking about books that are Stonewall Award winners or honored books. And the Stonewall Award is the first and oldest LGBTQ plus award for books. And they have awards in lots of different categories: fiction, nonfiction, children's, and lots more. So I'm Christopher, and I'm here as always with Lucy and Amanda. And we have a special guest, Elizabeth, that I want to thank a lot for being here. So, Amanda, what did you read this time?
The book I chose to read is called Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, and I absolutely loved this book. It's been on my reading list, and this book was published in 2020, and that is also when it won the Children's and Young Adult Literature Award for Stonewall. It was one of two that won it that year, and it is a YA book. It's written in verse, and it basically tells the story of a young mixed-race gay teen growing up in London with his family. He lives with his mother and his younger sister. His father is absent and not very present at all, wants nothing to do with his son. His father is Jamaican. His mother is Greek Cypriot. And it's just a fascinating, wonderful look into this young man as he's growing up. The book, it's chronological and it's in verse in his voice. So when he's very young, he really wants a Barbie doll. He wants a Barbie doll so bad and he doesn't get it. And then eventually he does get the Barbie doll. And then it's bookended with him at the end in university and discovering the drag society at his university where he finds himself. So between those two parts of his life, you got him growing up, coming of age, finding a best friend, finding people to be in a relationship with, discovering his sexuality, coming to terms and figuring out his who is he, what is his race, is he half this, half that, does he have a half sister, he uses those kinds of terms, but he's also a poet and he tends to express himself through poetry. So you've got in verse his voice sharing these moments in his life that are happening chronologically, but they're also interspersed with the poems he's writing at the time. So that's his form of expression. And it's just beautifully written. I just loved his voice. I loved his sense of self-discovery. And he really finds deep within himself who he is and who he's meant to be. He's meant to be the Black Flamingo, which ends up being sort of his drag character that he creates towards the end. But that character and who he becomes, even as Michael, is so much stronger and more fierce than he was as that 6-year-old boy or as a 12-year-old boy or a 15-year-old boy who was still coming to terms with his mixed family and his lack of a father and just discovering who he is sexually and racially. And it was just exquisitely written. I adored this book. I didn't want to put it down. I just loved it. And it's one of my favorite reads so far this year. So that is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. Elizabeth, what did you read?
Hi, thank you for having me as a guest today. I chose In the Dream House, a memoir by Carmen Maria Machado. I chose it because I started this endeavor by looking at lists of winners. I started off with 2020 because I wanted to read something recent. And I saw her on the list for this book that I've been wanting to read ever since I read her first collection of short stories. So after I read it, I was like, it won an honor. It won the Stonewall honor in nonfiction, which does count. But at first I was like, does it count? It's an honor. Yes. And then I was kind of like, that's kind of what this whole book is about, is whether or not something counts, whether or not it can be believed. And so she kind of interrogates this abusive relationship that she has with her lesbian partner throughout the book. And the title of the book, In the Dream House, is consistently mentioned throughout the text. Actually, every single chapter is Dream House as blank is the title. And she fills in that blank with whatever it's going to be. And it's usually a genre thing. So she'll use pulp genre, noir genre to explore the experiences that she had in this relationship. And the Dream House is also kind of a simultaneous reference for multiple things. It references the house that her partner lived in during this relationship. the period of time that all of this happened within herself, and then a metaphor for all the unrealized expectations that she had for this relationship, which was her first serious lesbian relationship. So it was kind of difficult to read. I really enjoyed it, but if you've been through abuse or something, if this is a touchy subject, it might be difficult to read. So she talks a lot about how the relationship evolved. And she writes this kind of in two different ways, a first person and a second person account. So she writes a lot of it as a letter to her former self, the self that experienced all of this. And she does a lot, like going through her personal experiences and framing it within a broader cultural context. So she talks a lot about, like in interviews and stuff, talks about how she dealt with talking about the crazy lesbian partner, because it is a stereotype projected onto queer people. And she's like, I don't want to create that stereotype, but this is what happened to me. And I think it's important as well, because she kind of highlights how homophobia, misogyny, and sexism all work together to keep victims of abuse silent. So it is unfortunately a universal experience. Women can't abuse their partners, though, like in broader cultural context, it's usually framed as something only happening to white, heterosexual, cis women, perpetrated by a cis male. So it's a lot to take in, but a very important topic, I think. And so she interrogates this idea that even in queer relationships, heteronormativity is still ascribed by broader culture, especially in saying like one person is the man and one is the woman. So it's like you can't break free of this binary that isn't actually a part of this queer relationship that exists outside of it. So I thought that was a really striking thing that she points out through the text. One of the examples she gives is of Deborah Reed, who was a Black lesbian woman who was being tried for murdering her abusive partner. And the media was framing her as the woman to get her off, basically, because she couldn't be a sympathetic character if she were the man in the relationship. So I just thought that was really interesting, sad, still relevant, that's still happening today. And so throughout this text, she is asking a lot of questions that really don't have answers. She pores over historical texts and uses a lot of like mythological references, fairy tales, things like that, and kind of picks out instances that she thinks are examples of queer relationships that had abuse in them, but just weren't really recognized by anyone. And she did find one text that was published the year she was born about lesbian partner violence. That was the only thing she found. So one of her endeavors in this book is to kind of bring together an archive of everything that she found. And she uses all of these examples to create kind of a foundation for other voices, which I found really interesting. And despite the difficult subject matter, I really love this book and I definitely recommend it. And again, that was In the Dream House, a memoir by Carmen Maria Machado. Lucy, what did you read this time?
Well, before I say what I read, I have to say, first of all, Amanda, I almost picked Black Flamingo because I love that book. It's so good. And also, Elizabeth, I have read In the Dream House, and I'm just, I think you did a great job. It's like such a multi-faceted, multi-layered book with so much stuff in it. So you did a great job, like touching everything that it approaches. So anyway, the book that I chose won the Barbara Giddings Award, so the award, the adult award in 2016. And it is a novel called The Gods of Tango by Carolina Di Robertes. And I've actually read several of her other books, which is why. But anyway, this is a really interesting story. It takes place in Argentina mostly, but it starts out in 1913 in Italy. And it is the story of a woman named Lita who is leaving this very small town in Italy to go to Argentina to be with her husband. she knows her husband Dante, but they were married by proxy. Like he was already in Argentina, and his uncle stood in for him at the wedding, which is already a very strange experience. So she's headed off to Buenos Aires to this life she doesn't know, this man she doesn't really know that much, but she thinks it will be an improvement from the small town life in Italy. She arrives in Argentina to find not only was her husband Dante living in sort of like very, it's almost like a tenement and just a small room and not offering much improvement in her life, but also he's dead. So she arrives and she has no husband. And he was killed in a labor protest. And so this is sort of where the story starts. She brings with her a violin, and she can hear in the courtyard of where she lives this violin being played, and she's very intrigued. Someone's playing the tango on the violin. Women at this time were not allowed to play the tango, and she becomes obsessed with trying to do that. So she starts dressing in Dante's clothes because they're left behind, and she really embraces being Dante right from the start, not just because she is afforded more freedom for it, but also her relationships change because of it, and she's able to conduct different relationships as a man. And so she moves out of the little tenement housing where she's living, and she starts living completely as a man named Dante. And she plays music. She's very well known for seducing women, for falling in love with them. Nobody knows her secret, and she finally feels like she is herself, and she is who she's meant to be. This book's really interesting because it takes you into like the bar rooms and the brothels in Buenos Aires. You learn about the history of tango and how it really started as a dance between men who were waiting in the brothels for their turn to go be with a woman, and how it was just a very male dance. And Dear Beatrice does a really interesting thing too when she's switching back and forth between Dante and Lita. Like in the beginning, she talks about Lita being both these people, so she uses both pronouns. And then as Lita sort of becoming Dante, she still uses both. But once Lita is Dante completely, they have switched to he, him pronouns. And so the way that the author does that is really interesting because it just is a really good reflection of how Dante is discovering himself. And it's just it's a great read. It's fascinating. Like I learned so much about the history at that time, and tango itself, the world that it takes place in, is really interesting. And I think it's interesting also that she was writing a book about, like, just because there aren't a lot of people like Dante that we read about in history doesn't mean it didn't exist. And that's something I've read in other books of hers as well, where she's really giving a voice to marginalized people, but people who have always been there and had an impact on history. So that is The Gods of Tango by Carolina de Robertis. Christopher, what did you read?
Well, I just wanted to say how interesting it is that when we read fiction, we're also learning so much that's true. And I find this to happen to me all the time. Not only do we get this other perspective on things and people and places and times, but sometimes you just learn so much. And I happen to do that with my book, even though it's a fictional title. So at first, I'll just say I was going through the Stonewall list, and I did have a little bit of a hard time finding some of the titles that I'd wanted to read. So hopefully we can fix that a little bit at the library. I don't know if anyone else felt like that. The book I chose is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. And I, of course, was drawn to this book right from the start because of the title. This is exactly the kind of title that would draw me in. The book is written it's addressed to a second person, so it's all to you, because this is really a letter that he is writing to his mother. And it is very impressionistic, which is also a feature I love with books. It doesn't exactly follow a linear plot, but there are lots of diversions along the way, lots of recollections, lots of stories of a mother and grandmother and a grandfather. And so we get all of these themes of war and loneliness and family and what it means to belong and to be an immigrant and the fleeting nature of life. And and sexuality. So there's so much packed into this book. I really loved it. I read it really quickly, and it had a very funny feel to it in terms of it felt like I was reading a book that was set in the 1950s for some reason. I think because it was so quiet and everything seems kind of calm for some reason, even scenes of being bullied or scenes with sex in them. It all seemed very calm. And then it's quickly punctuated by references to things that are very, very current and contemporary. So I really enjoyed that as well. It felt a little anachronistic, even though it wasn't. It was fantastic. I loved it. You know me, I don't really like to go into too much of the plot, but as Ocean discovers or expresses his sexuality, he meets someone on a tobacco farm, and there are lots of scenes of them together and thinking about life and having sex, and they really seem to be from different worlds. Ultimately, at the end, the main character is reflecting on death, and it really kind of wraps up there. I don't like to be too explicit with my plots, but it was a wonderful book. So that was On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. Does anyone have any last comments for the episode? No? Okay. Well, as always, we'd love to know what you're reading, and you can let us know in the comments on the AADL site below. And until next time, happy reading. Oh, and I want to thank our guest, Elizabeth, for joining us this episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you.